Hey, it's Greg Nicotero. You are, or if you're not, should be watching Alpha Romero on YouTube.
And I wanted to ask you guys this question because I know the answer, but I know my answer, but I wanted to kind of pick your brains.
Why are you asking it, Matt?
Well, I know my
I know
answer.
the answer, but I want to see if you guys
I want to know your answer.
Okay,
so
go ahead.
We're all fans of cinema. Like, we all appreciate different films, different directors. But I want to ask you, why George? And my answer, and I'm going to get kind of deep in just a minute here, but the thing about George is George was a proletarian. He gave a shit about the blue collar. He gave a shit about people. And I think that's really what it is for me, because it comes through in his films, but more importantly, it comes through in us, in the fans. Mm-hmm. We care about each other, and that's reflective of him and his work. You know, when I was a kid, Day of the Dead, that was my introduction. And that's such a dark, heavy movie, and it resonated so much with me. And, going through the stuff that I went through as a kid and kind of feeling that isolation and stuff like that, seeing that film that George made, it made me feel like I wasn't alone. You know what I mean? And I wanted to, I thank him for that every day. And that's why I think I return to Pittsburgh every year, is because it's a gift to that 12-year-old kid. You know what I mean? It's a gift to be able to go to this place and see these things and experience these things, but also it's a gift to see you guys and to hang out with you and to share these things with you, because I didn't have that when I was a kid. We've talked about this. All my friends, they were all into different shit. Nobody understood or spoke my language, but you guys do. And everybody in the chat does. Everybody that's at the convention does. You know what I mean? So that's what it is for me. I think that's why, I love Fulci. I love, all sorts of different directors. But I know George cared about people, and it makes me feel like he cared about me. And in sort of roundabout way, he does through you guys. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll answer that, and then I guess we could just go around the round table, as they say. So for me, a lot of that of what you just said is very true, like for me as well. Another thing about George was that he was very anti-establishment. He was punk rock, and I was very anti-establishment, very punk rock when I was a teenager, and was big into George. George would say, "I'm doing this, like this is my vision. The Dawn of the Dead, I'm not cutting anything. Like, just say no. We'll release it unrated. I want my vision out there." I love that about George. And the fact that George was anti-Hollywood, like, I'll stay here in Pittsburgh and make these little movies with my friends. I'd rather do that than take a big payday from Hollywood to make whatever sterile thing they want me to make, just to put my name on it or whatever. That always drew me to George. And then I think that's a big thing too. But what you said, like the blue collar, he's the blue collar filmmaker. I've said that before. He's the blue collar horror director. It's like, I love Argento, Fulci, Carpenter. Carpenter's kind of in the same vein a little bit, but Carpenter was definitely, I've said it before, is, kind of, he was not that Carpenter didn't have principles or but Carpenter would take a job, kind of thing. Right. It was like, okay, like Christine or something. It's like Carpenter said, the thing didn't work, so I'll do Christine. And Carpenter hates Christine for whatever reason, but I like Christine. But George was just,
great movie.
Yeah, I love Christine. But George was just so uncompromising in times when, he probably should have been, and most directors probably would have been. And it taught me to kind of stand up for myself and my beliefs. And
he had integrity.
Yes, and the idea that we don't have to go to Hollywood to make these movies. We can just make them right here in Pittsburgh. Like we just us. Like, we don't need big budgets and all that. It's like, and I think he taught a lot of independent filmmakers that. Like, I mean, you listen to Tarantino talk about George, or a lot of those indie filmmakers in the '90s when they would talk about their influences and stuff. And George is it's kind of like, like Kevin Smith makes movies in New Jersey. It's like nobody makes movies in New Jersey until George makes movies in Pittsburgh, and then all of a sudden Pittsburgh is a filmmaking hub, and you're getting Silence of the Lambs and Sudden Impact or whatever that fucking movie, the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie. It's like all these movies start going to Pittsburgh, you know. So that was always inspirational to me. And when I would make my little movies in high school, that was my dream. I'm going to be the next George Romero. And I knew that, like, working with, like, my cousins, friends, or whatever, I would always follow the Romero way of doing things. I would listen to their input. I was always interested. Okay, how would you do this? Like, anybody got any ideas? Because that was always the thing with George, was like, he was open to ideas. So he was always collaborative, and I always tried to model myself after that. And he was a good role model to look up to in that way. So I don't know. There's a million different reasons, but that's a great question. John, what's your answer, sir? We'll go to you next.
I think that's the beautiful part, is that it's like this. It's a beautiful mystery. No one really knows why. Now, I'm not a film buff. I don't care about movies in general.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, and I think that's really interesting. Like, John could give a shit about most movies, but Romero, it's like that's the thing.
That's why I'm more curious about you than anybody, John.
When I got older, I was just renting these movies randomly off of Blockbuster. And it's nice because this was obviously around the time of the internet, but it wasn't that popular. And it turned out, years later, all the movies that I have posters of, Night and Dawn and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween, are like the movies that everybody loves, without realizing that pretty much they're also all independent films, or they were made, independently. But I was a guitar player. All I cared about was guitar stuff. But when I watched Dawn of the Dead, I said, this is the coolest movie I ever saw. I never found Night or any of those movies scary. I watched Halloween. I had all the Friday the 13th, but I always gravitated to George's stuff, and I have no idea why. And I think it's just George's personality that shines through in this ethereal kind of way. I can't describe it. You just get a sense of him as a person, which is weird because they're like horror movies, but they're not really horror. They're kind of fun. It's really hard to describe. I think it's just George's personality that sort of comes through. Like, you can almost have this like sense of how much fun that they were making it. You know what I mean? Like, you even get the impression that, like, the guy that made this film is probably like a big jerk, And then like, it's also part of it is
like Kubrick or something,
Yeah, you just watch those interviews and you go, yeah, man, he's just a cool guy. And also the layer of, you can watch the film like how I did, like an idiot, was just like, wow, look at how cool that is. There's zombies in the mall, and they have all this stuff, and then maturing and going, oh, it's about material possessions and how this stuff isn't important.
Consumerism.
Or then watching Knight Riders and thinking, oh, it's actually about George, and then starting to, the page turns, and then you get to watch the movie in a different light, and the movie takes another dimension. You get to watch it with new eyes, and that blend of, like, to me, this is really cool and this is really smart, I think is like part of how George, George skipped a couple of years in school. He, like, they wanted to bump him up to, like, he skipped 2 years of school and they wanted to bump him up to a third year, and his parents didn't let him, which is why he went to the Sutfield Academy, because it was like, you're done with high school. We don't know what to do with you. So they put him in another school. So you've got this, like, very smart, but also very lovable, fun-loving guy that just, like, and it's funny because you watch those commentaries. I watched the Martin one, the one and with him and Donald, and I'm like, this is great because George is having a great time. Just like, and it's never any detail stuff. It's very smart, but it's not pretentious. It's not like, well, I thought this out and I did this. We're like, we're just shooting stuff and we're doing this and we're having a fun time. Forget about it and that kind of stuff. And it's like, you can't help but just love who this guy is. And there is that enigmatic thing about him that people were just drawn. Christine said the same thing. People are just drawn to him. And it has to come through in his films where it doesn't for other people. Him and Carpenter and other guys have made all these great films, but they don't have this kind of, like, you can go to the Halloween convention, but I always find those things kind of sterile because you have all these movies made by different people, all these different Michael Myers and everybody. I'm going to get some heat for this, but I think of it as the Star Wars for horror movies. That's how I think of Halloween. I love the Halloween franchise. I love Halloween 1. I told you I've got the signed thing from Daniel Farrens for Halloween 6. VHS that he sent to me from an AOL chat room. So I was there. But as I've gotten older and I've kind of looked at it, it seems like the Halloween stuff is kind of superficial, but the George stuff is very genuine. And that's what I mean. There's this like, je ne sais quoi about it that you just, why are we all connected? I have no idea. I'm glad that we are, but the beauty part of it is there's no answer. We just are.
Well, the family aspect of it too. It's like everybody that worked on a Romero film talked about it. It was like a family atmosphere. Mm-hmm. You see that in like Night Riders. Night Riders is a perfect example of like George encapsulating what it was like being on the crew of his films. Was like they were just a family. They worked together and traveled together and all that. And you still see it now in like at Living Dead weekend. It's like these people come together, and people that aren't even there to like have a booth or make money. Like Tommy Lafitte will just show up just to hang out and say hi to everybody. Jeannie Jeffries.
Jeannie Jeffries and Denise Kiss and John Kiss, they're not even invited this year, but they're still fucking coming. They're still coming because they want to be a part of it. They are a part of it.
I do want to make a declaration about that. Is George did want the control for the film, but he was also incredibly generous to include everybody else with him. He was like the president that didn't have all the answers. He was like, well, I want to make the final say, but I want to hear from everybody.
He was a president, not a dictator.
He's democratic,
yeah. And I think also from what you said about, I mean, that's one of the reasons why he had so much trouble with Vanilla was he did not want to be sort of pigeonholed. He wanted to sort of be taken a little bit more seriously as an artist and a director. But where was I going with this? God damn it. This one isn't happening.
It's a big open-ended question that Matt asked there. I rambled on about it too for a while. What about you?
It took me 41 years to really think about it. You know what I mean? Like, because I could never put my finger on it.
I still think about it now. I'm like, dude, you spend so much time, like every episode, like you do a YouTube channel that's around Romero. Like every stream, everything you talk about is about Romero, but you never get tired of talking about Romero. Are you mentally are you unwell? Like, should I check myself into it? I'm just like, no, it's just kind of like,
and it may be hard to articulate, but it's there. You know what I mean? There's a reason why you do this, and there's a reason why we continue to show up, and it's beautiful, whatever it is.
Now I remember what I was going to say, because if you brought up a point about making films, and it's like, well, that's what I with Vanilla. Like George had said, I can get a film financed easily, but it's not the film that I want to make. And I think that speaks a lot to his ability as an artist, because he was a great actual artist. Like the art will just find. That's why I think if he played an instrument, he would have been great. But he did things on his terms, and there's really something to be respected about that. Like the guitar player that I met Jim through, Alan Holdsworth. I talked to Christine about this because he was a guy who played really unusual music, but he had an incredibly loyal, diehard fan base and was completely independent. People were like, Eddie Van Halen was a huge fan of his and would like wish he got the spotlight, but Alan always wanted to do things on his term, even if it meant not really making that much money. And it's a shame sometimes on the business aspect because you feel like this guy did so much, he deserves so much more. But there's also something to be said about the man's artistic integrity. He made the films he wanted to make, and I think that shines through. It's not phony. He's not phoning it in, even if it's not the movie that he wanted it to be, or not the film that the audience wanted to see. He did the things his way, and there's something really to be respected about. And I think we also can pick up of George as being the friendly genius artist. And that's kind of what Alan was. Alan Holdsworth was a guy, he'd go up on stage, he'd play amazing, and then he'd go sit by the bar and have a drink with everybody. He was like your friend that was incredible at what he did. He wasn't like,
you're amazingly talented friend. Yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't like, that's the guy over there. He does his thing and you can't see him anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Now he's going to his dressing room. Don't bother him. It was more, because that's how George was when I met him in 2008. Like, Texas Frightmare Weekend is like, of course, going there. Like I remember specifically, and I don't know if my dad's watching this. He's been watching my streams lately, but I remember this specifically, like going and my dad telling me, he was like, "Are you sure you want to meet him?" I was like, yeah, I mean, I definitely want to meet him. And he was like, what if he's just this old grouchy asshole? And I never thought of it, but I was like, yeah, what if he is? So I was kind of worried to meet him like in person for the first time. And then you meet him and it's just like I'm nervous as shit, but he's so like disengaging. It's just like, oh, hey, it's just as nice as you could possibly hope for. And it's like, oh, okay, well, that's kind of, and it's like the whole term, don't meet your heroes type of thing. And, but it's like that you couldn't ask for anything better than meeting George and just the way that he was. He kind of matched what you were hoping for, I guess. I don't know what the fuck I was starting off on that, but
it's funny because it was like he was very friendly to everybody else, but very dismissive of his own work. And I feel that people that are geniuses, John Lennon, oh, it's a piece of crap I just wrote in 2 seconds. It's like, no, people love this thing. Alan Holdsworth, I played awful today. No, you played this amazing thing. A lot of these people are like almost too humble. And I think like that's almost like a sign of like a real sort of genius or intelligence, because you're just, whatever, I just threw it together. It's like, no, you did this amazing piece of work. And I'm glad.
That was like the heartbreaking thing. I remember hearing Suze say, like Suzanne, and I think it was an interview that she did on the Garf or something like that, where she said that like right at the end when he was starting to get really ill, like she asked him like, what do you make of like your legacy and stuff? And George was just like, nobody cares. And it was like,
it's so crazy.
So many people care, but he just never. It was just. I don't know if he was just wanting the mainstream accolades. He wanted to be as recognized as Spielberg or something, but it was just like he didn't quite understand his impact, or he was so, I guess, humble to the point where he didn't know how to accept it, to just be like, oh yeah, I did some pretty cool stuff and I influenced so much.
Have you, I'm sure you've heard the interview that he did with Guillermo del Toro, where he's just like showering him with praises the whole time. And George is like, shut the fuck up, please. Please stop.
Yeah. The whole time Guillermo would be going into like this deep thought out, like, oh, this is what this meant. And George is just like, I don't know.
Yeah, whatever.
I don't know what the fuck I'm doing,
I'm glad he did that, because it was someone that was on George's level to let him know how good he actually was. It wasn't like, it'd be nice if it's a fan that does it, but now it's a fellow colleague that's like, no, you are important. And what you said is exactly what I was going to say about Susan, about the, no legacy. And she's like, oh yeah. And she shoved it up his butt with like, with the library. And it's true. It's like, we're all here to prove him wrong. Obviously that people do care. So I'm glad that he was that dismissive, because that's what sort of set the domino effect of like, okay, well, we'll show you that people actually do care. And they do. But I think that's that humbleness where it's the genius, where it's just like, it's so easy for them. If they didn't put any work into it, it can't be that good, as compared to some of those other. And I think that might have been how he felt, because it seems to be artists, and I see this a lot for music stuff, are the worst critics for their own work, where they don't understand how good or how impactful their material is. Like my own band's songs, I don't remember them. I was like, what's the name of that song? Not that we're that important, but I care sometimes so little. Like, what's the name of that? How does that thing go? But I know every note of Alan Holdsworth's like music. You know what I mean? So I think
you
I
get your own shit. Yeah, you're just like, hey, that's just a bullshit. But
and I think it's for him. It came so easy, and he didn't see it as that much of a challenge. Like, oh, you're just a brilliant. Well, I'm just taking as many shots and throwing them together in this. And even in that commentary for Martin, it was John Amplis or someone that was like, maybe it was Richard Rubinstein, which was interesting because that commentary was in the mid 2000s, and I thought it was weird that they were talking. But Richard was like, no, you like took all these shots together, and he's like, well, that's just a whatever. He's like, no, you're a genius for doing this kind of stuff, and let me tell you why, and because it was just so easy to him that he wouldn't have to think about it, whereas other people were like, no,
George never understood his own success. I think George was just kind of like, what am I? I didn't do anything. Like, I've done nothing great. I'm just why? Well, you like this movie? Why? Like, why do you like this movie? He never seemed to understand his own success, which was always kind of one of those things that kind of drew me to him too. Was just always kind of stay humble. It's like, oh, I don't understand like why you like this, but it's.
Well, you see it.
I don't know, but that's kind of what made him great. It's just kind of like, I don't know.
When they do the screenings for a night, he's like, all this talk about this movie. It's like,
Yeah,
yes, George,
yeah.
this actually movie is really important because maybe you didn't see Dwayne as black, everyone else did, and they could at least understand, even if it wasn't written in the script, the implications that this film had. Because I think George's problem is he likes to see the film as like, well, this movie isn't good because I didn't have the people with their looking at their eye line and all this kind of stuff. Knight Riders is a better made film. It's like, well, yeah, it's got a good story, but like, there's more to being a director than just like those little mistakes. And I think for George, his opinion of the film is about how good of a job he did directing it, like compared to like a Spielberg. And it's like, that's not important, because if it was, Knight wouldn't have done nearly as well as it did. People would have looked at it and said, yeah, you can see their eyes don't, why am I watching this thing? The story and the mood that the film set was so much more important than the stuff that makes you like a real director. Obviously, it doesn't matter. The story and what you're doing shines through. And I think George couldn't see that. Oh, we didn't even know what Foley was until Knight Riders. What difference does it make? The film itself, the end result is more important than knowing those little details.
Yeah. Smith, what draws you to Romero?
Well, a lot of it was already said, but I got to say, not just because he's from, Pittsburgh, steel town, working class kind of environment and stuff like that, but he really was a man of the people in his presentation, in his characterizations. But he was certainly not one dimensional like a lot of people are. Like we were talking about Resident Evil, and look who ended up making Resident Evil. Paul W.S. Anderson is one notch above Uwe Boll, right? So it was just garbage, right? I hate those movies, but so George would have done a good job with that. But you look at his stuff, he's done different genres. He's had multiple layers of stuff. It's like he's a little bit of comedy in his movies, a little bit of action, maybe a lot of action, some horror, not all horror, even though he's billed as a horror director. Social commentary, incredible tactician when it comes to like the script and the editing, as we talked about with even editing library music with Goblin and stuff in Dawn of the Dead to make a custom track for the Stinger, which is fucking crazy. No one did shit like that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even John Carpenter, all the credit he gets for music, he's kind of nothing without Alan Howarth. He's not a one-man show. But in a lot of ways, George, he had a huge crew and a family environment and stuff like that, but he kind of was a one-man show for a lot of it. He could take a lot of the credit, I think, for his work. Although he did create this amazing atmosphere. And it's funny because you get these vibes from his movies, even though something like Day has all this darkness in it because it's depicting a horrible time period and a horrible outlook for humanity, what's left of it. And yet it's still humor in there. And there's still, quirky bits and other kinds of stuff that's George, right? That's George's little thing of never completely like making it, it's not so heavy, come out so depressed, right?
Yeah.
Or it's not so silly that you're like, oh, that was too silly. He shouldn't have done that. But, and I like the fact his smaller movies, I always thought were his best movies. When he started going a little more studio, I think those are his weaker movies. It was better when he had the more family environment, typical crew. And when you listen to the commentaries and you look at the behind the scenes, the family environment totally makes sense because he's already got that vibe in the movies. It's part of the DNA of the movies. Mm-hmm. And so it does not like, oh, I didn't know he had an environment like that. It just made sense. You didn't have to think about why is this so family environment on the set? It's there. You just kind of, it's the gestalt. You just kind of, you don't think about it, but it's in there. You just feel it.
Yeah.
And so he just creates this amazing vibe. And yeah, not all of his movies are amazing, of course. Everyone's got, good and bad movies. But when you're seeing a George Romero movie, how you feel, how it looks. There's a lot of precision in there. There's a lot of artistic integrity in there. Generally has really good acting, good writing. And so I would so much more recommend a lot of his movies to people as general watching people, whatever, than so many other directors, even though I revere a lot of directors and stuff. It's just his movies are more down to earth in a lot of ways, more approachable, but still have these like heady, like commentary, social commentary, and smart stuff. He was a smart dude for sure.
Yeah.
So
I
love it.
You mentioned his editing too. I mean, that was kind of a big thing that attracted me and really what made me want to be kind of an editor. That's kind of my favorite aspect of
Sure.
George's career was his editing. You know,
And he learned to
Um,
overshoot, which is smart because you never know. It's not fix it in the mix, but it's like, hey, I might have a different idea later that works better. So let's
mhm.
overshoot the shit out of stuff. And now we have options. We're not like, oh, now we really have to fix
Cover
it.
your
'Cause we
ass.
forgot this angle, and we have to do some weird reuse of shots. Sometimes you see that in movies they actually reuse a lot of shots. I'm like, oh, I don't do that, you know. So,
Yeah,
Well, they had
Smart
to at
guy.
night, but that wasn't his. That wasn't
yeah,
his.
sure, sure.
yeah. What about you, Brandon? As somebody who has put the work and the time in to become a filmmaker yourself, and obviously revere George enough to make him the subject of one of your films. What is it about George that attracted you to his films and just his legacy in general, I guess?
Well, it's someone that's learning to be a good film director. That's going to be a lifelong goal of mine. Just keep learning. But George was the first director that I would listen to interviews, read interviews in magazines, and just get bits and pieces. He was the first film director that I looked at, and because of him, I said, I could do this too. Because everyone else, they're making, I mean, at the time in the 90s, 20 million, 30 million, $50 million movies, maybe more. And George was always here's the little cheap way that we did this shot, and we do this effect, and that was more impressionable on me, because it really did make me go, I could get other people around me that want to make movies, and we could go off and make a movie. It's actually
It's like a let's
possible.
put on a show thing. Hey, let's put on a show.
Yeah.
Let's do something fun. You know.
Yeah, and then over the years, you could just see people that worked with him, how much they revered him for the fact that they truly felt valued. It wasn't just, hey, we're going to go make this movie and you're going to be treated like dog shit and here's
Right.
your cold cut. Everyone that worked with him walked away feeling like they contributed something of value, and it wasn't just getting churned up and grinded by the industry. And you see that now, because look at how many people that come to Living Dead weekend as guests, and they just gush about George
Mick
Romero.
Darrow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to hear those stories, because it reinforces, for me, the kind of director that I want to be. That is the standard. And I love the fact that George was fiercely independent. One of the quotes that was used in the documentary, which he was talking about with why he got fired from Resident Evil, he said, I always fought. He said, I was never in a position where I'd just say, okay, let's go shoot this piece of shit. He's like, I always, and that really spoke to me, is like, okay, every film that he did, he was passionate about.
He had integrity. Yeah.
There was integrity. And I love John Carpenter, but there are some films of his that, like Village of the Damned. Village of the Damned is a studio requirement. He was under contract. They said, hey, we'll let you make this movie, but you got to direct Village of the Damned. And he was like, okay. It just, and it's a film that feels to me very weak. It's like, and Carpenter himself is very dismissive of a lot of the stuff.
He had several in a row that were just terrible, actually. So
yeah.
Oh yeah.
So, and to this day, I still feel like Carpenter did Escape from LA is just a slap in the face to the industry, because it feels like it's making fun of sequels.
It
is, But with George's films, you can find stuff to love about them, and the only other thing that I would say, which is to caution a lot of people about, because I have heard it, and I'm usually the one out there coming out of the gate hooking and jabbing about it. But you look at how many of George's fans revere Night, revere Dawn, revere Day. When it comes to Land, it's like, And then you get the Diary and Survival, and they're like, "Oh, that's a piece of shit." And
Well,
and
start asking some of them about Vanilla and Jack's Wife. Half. I don't want to say half of Romero fans don't even know what those films are,
They
but
haven't seen
it's
them.
a huge majority that just gravitate towards the zombie stuff.
I love everything that George did because
Right.
I find something to love. And there was a
Absolutely.
while where I actually had a little meme going that I made, which was the soldier from the movie Civil War, and it was like, "Oh, you're a Romero fan." It's like, what kind of Romero fan?
Yeah.
Well, that's what I said. Most
remember
people
that.
think of him as a horror director, and he wasn't just horror, but that's how most of his fans.
But
are.
I brought up the point before that it's like, yeah, it's well and good to have your favorite Romero film that's now 30, 40, 50 years old. But what are you going to do in 10 years? Are you just going to stop being a Romero fan because everyone that worked on these films is gone? Like, you better start loving something about Diary and Survival. If you love Living Dead Weekend, if you love, the Living Dead Museum, if you love all of these events that do things for George, you might want to start loving his later works because
those are becoming the classics now.
Right.
20 years of Land of the Dead. I just watched it again the other night. I'm just like, 20 years. Like, I remember seeing it in the theater, but.
And I will say this. I do love Survival. There's some troubling parts of it, but overall I love it. And the reason why I love it is because George had the opportunity to make a sequel to Land. Universal was happy. That came straight from Peter Grunwald, his producer partner. They were ready. Like, yeah, it did well for us. And George hated working on Land of the Dead so much because of the studio system. He was like, nah, I'm good. And he went off and made Diary. He was like, nope, I'm going to go make Diary. Less problems. And when it came to Survival, he finally got to make his Western. And he got to go out the same way he came in, being independent. And again, as someone who's going to be spending the rest of his life learning to be a good director, that leaves more an impression on me than if God, could you imagine Romero being under contract and it's like, okay, for your third film, since we gave you Land of the Dead 2, you're going to have to direct Captain America Civil War. And like he's just sitting there and he's like, I don't even get to direct half the fucking movie because it's all CG. Like, you can imagine just like how disappointed he would be that he's like not even making half the movie.
Well, that's like Ready Player One, where it's almost all CG, right?
Yeah.
Like I just can't imagine that happening. So I'm like really happy that he got to go out the way that he wanted, being independent.
Yeah.
He never got to the point where, again, he's just going through the motions for a paycheck. He had that integrity through his entire fucking career. And what's not to love about that kind of legacy? And you look at him now. It's a shame he didn't get to see it, but he has a university that has an archive of all his work. And I'm sorry, but you don't see Toby Hooper.
No, you don't.
You don't. Wes Craven. You don't see an archive of his work. And think about all the other directors there are. Like, George Romero was that revered, that important to cinema.